My dear friends, I want to share with you today one of the most heart-wrenching yet inspiring elderly wisdom stories I've ever encountered. It's about a grandmother named Margaret Collins, and before I tell you what happened to her, I need you to imagine this. You're 68 years old, you've already buried the love of your life, and you think the worst of life's storms have passed you by? Then the phone rings at 2:17 in the morning. Margaret had been asleep in her modest two-bedroom home in Columbus, Ohio, when that call shattered her world forever. The voice on the other end belonged to a police officer, and the words he spoke would haunt her for months to come. "Ma'am, I'm sorry to inform you that your daughter Emily was killed in a car accident on Route 71 tonight." Now, you and I both know that there are phone calls in life that divide your existence into before and after. This was Margaret's dividing line. Emily Prescott, just 40 years old, had been driving home from her book club meeting when a drunk driver ran a red light and slammed into her sedan. She died instantly, they said, which was supposed to be some small comfort. But when you're a mother who's just lost her only child, there's no such thing as comfort. Margaret had already weathered one of life's cruelest storms when her husband Robert passed from lung cancer 8 years earlier. She thought she'd learned how to carry grief, how to wake up each morning and find a reason to keep going. But losing Emily, this touching family story, took a turn that no parent should ever have to navigate. The pain was different, deeper somehow, like losing a piece of your own soul. What made this tragedy even more complex was Emily's 10-year-old daughter, Chloe. That precious little girl with Emily's same auburn hair and curious green eyes was now an orphan in every sense that mattered. Oh, she had a father, Daniel Prescott, a successful businessman who owned 3 auto dealerships across central Ohio. But as Margaret would soon discover, having a living parent and having a loving parent are two very different things. The night of the accident, it was Margaret who held Chloe as the child sobbed herself to sleep. It was Margaret who made the funeral arrangements, while Daniel seemed more concerned with calling his insurance company than comforting his daughter. And it was Margaret who noticed how Chloe flinched whenever her father raised his voice, which happened more often than any child should have to endure. You see, Emily and Daniel's marriage had been rocky for years. What started as a fairy tale romance between a small-town librarian and an ambitious entrepreneur had slowly crumbled under the weight of Daniel's wandering eye and Emily's growing independence. Emily had confided in her mother just months before the accident that she was considering divorce, that she'd been documenting Daniel's neglect and preparing to fight for sole custody of Chloe. "Mom," Emily had said during their last phone conversation, just 3 days before the accident, "I need to know that if anything ever happens to me, you'll take care of Chloe." Daniel loves the idea of being a father, but he doesn't love the work of actually being one. Margaret had laughed it off then, telling Emily she was being dramatic, that things would work out. How she wished now that she'd taken her daughter's concerns more seriously. This emotional grandmother story was just beginning to unfold, and Margaret had no idea how dark things were about to get. The funeral was held on a gray October morning at St. Matthew's Lutheran Church, where Emily had been confirmed and married. The sanctuary was packed with Emily's former students, library colleagues, neighbors, and family friends. Daniel played the grieving widower perfectly, accepting condolences with just the right amount of stoic sorrow. But Margaret noticed things others missed. She saw how he checked his phone during the eulogy. She heard him discussing a potential property deal with his business partner in the church parking lot. She watched how he barely acknowledged Chloe's tears, leaving the child to cling to her grandmother's black dress. After the service, people gathered at Margaret's house for the traditional meal, her kitchen filled with casserole dishes and sympathy cards, the familiar ritual of a community caring for its grieving. Neighbors brought their famous recipes. Church ladies organized a food service, and everyone shared stories about Emily's kindness and bright spirit. But through it all, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong with this picture. Daniel spent most of the gathering on his phone in Margaret's backyard, pacing back and forth while having heated conversations in hushed tones. When Margaret's sister Clara asked him about Chloe's schooling and whether he'd need help with childcare arrangements, Daniel's response was telling. "We'll figure all that out once the estate gets settled. There are a lot of financial details to work through first." Financial details. Not, "I need to help my daughter grieve." Not, "Chloe needs stability right now." Financial details. Margaret felt a chill run down her spine that had nothing to do with the October weather. This wasn't the language of a devastated father. This was the language of a businessman calculating his next move. That night, after the last guest had left and the dishes were washed, Margaret sat in her living room with Chloe curled up beside her on the old floral sofa. The child had been unusually quiet all day, even for a 10-year-old who just buried her mother. Finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, Chloe said, "Grandma Margaret, do I have to go live with Daddy now?" The question broke Margaret's heart, but the fear in Chloe's eyes broke it even more. "Sweetheart," Margaret said carefully, "your daddy loves you. You're going to be okay." "But he's always angry," Chloe whispered, "and he leaves me alone a lot when he goes on trips. Mommy said she was going to fix it, but now she can't." The child's words hung in the air like a confession, and Margaret realized that this family betrayal story was far more complicated than anyone knew. That night, after Chloe finally fell asleep in Emily's old bedroom, Margaret made herself a cup of tea and sat at her kitchen table, the same one where she'd helped Emily with homework all those years ago. She thought about her daughter's final phone call, about Daniel's strange behavior, about the fear in her granddaughter's eyes. Something wasn't right, and every grandmother instinct she possessed was screaming at her to pay attention. She had no idea that Emily had been preparing for this exact scenario, or that her daughter had taken steps to protect Chloe that would soon turn this tragedy into an all-out war. The inheritance drama that was about to unfold would test everything Margaret thought she knew about her family, about justice, and about how far grandmother would go to save the child she loved. The first sign that Daniel Prescott wasn't a grieving widower. He appeared to become exactly 1 week after Emily's funeral. Margaret was at the grocery store, picking up ingredients to make Chloe's favorite chicken and dumplings, when she ran into Janet Morrison from the church choir. Janet pulled her aside near the frozen food section and, with the kind of concerned whisper that usually preceded uncomfortable truths, said, "Margaret, honey, I probably shouldn't tell you this, but my cousin works at the Marriott downtown, and she said she saw Daniel there last Tuesday night, with a woman, a blonde woman who definitely wasn't Emily. Last Tuesday night. That was 2 days before the accident." Margaret felt the frozen peas in her hand grow heavier as the implication sank in. While Emily was at home helping Chloe with her science project about the solar system, her husband was apparently entertaining another woman at a downtown hotel. Margaret thanked Janet and finished her shopping in a daze, but that seed of suspicion had been planted. Over the next few days, she found herself noticing things she might have overlooked before, like how Daniel seemed more interested in going through Emily's desk and filing cabinets than in spending time with Chloe, like how he'd had 3 different meetings with various financial advisors in just 10 days, like how he'd already started making comments about selling Emily's house and simplifying things for everyone involved. Simplifying things for everyone. That phrase kept echoing in Margaret's mind as she watched her son-in-law sort through Emily's personal belongings with the efficiency of someone conducting an inventory rather than the tenderness of someone mourning his wife. This inspiring elderly story was becoming something much darker, and Margaret's protective instincts were starting to override her desire to think the best of people. The breaking point came during Chloe's first week back at school. Margaret had picked up the child as she'd been doing since the accident, and Chloe was unusually quiet during the drive home. Finally, as they pulled into Margaret's driveway, the little girl said, "Grandma, Daddy said I can't talk about Mommy anymore because it makes me too sad. But I want to talk about her. Is that okay?" Margaret turned off the engine and looked at her granddaughter's confused face. "Sweet pea, it's absolutely okay to talk about your mama. In fact, it's important. She was your mother, and she loved you more than anything in this world." "That's what I thought," Chloe said, relief evident in her voice. "But Daddy said I need to move forward, and that dwelling on Mommy won't bring her back. He said if I keep being sad, I'll make myself sick." The child paused and added in an even smaller voice, "He also said if I don't stop crying so much, he might have to send me away to get better." Margaret's blood ran cold. Send her away? What kind of father threatens to send his grieving 10-year-old daughter away for the crime of missing her dead mother? This wasn't grief counseling or professional help Daniel was suggesting. This sounded like a threat designed to silence a child. That evening, Margaret called her longtime friend Harold Green, who'd been the family's attorney for over 20 years. Harold had handled Robert's will and had known Emily since she was Chloe's age. If anyone could help her understand what was happening, it would be Harold. Margaret, Harold's familiar voice was warm but concerned when she explained her worries. "I'm glad you called. I've been meaning to reach out to you anyway. Emily came to see me about 4 months ago, and there are some things you need to know." They arranged to meet the next day at Harold's office, a cozy space above the hardware store on Main Street that had served the legal needs of their small community for decades. Margaret arrived early, her hand shaking slightly as she climbed the familiar wooden stairs. Harold greeted her with a gentle hug and led her to the chair across from his desk, the same chair where she'd sat with Robert to plan their wills all those years ago. "Margaret, what I'm about to tell you might be difficult to hear, but Emily was very specific about her wishes." Harold opened a thick file folder and pulled out several documents. "She came to me in June, quite distressed about her marriage. She discovered that Daniel was not only having an affair, but had been systematically moving money out of their joint accounts and into investments she couldn't access." Margaret listened in stunned silence as Harold continued. Emily was particularly worried about Chloe's welfare. She documented several incidents where Daniel had left Chloe alone overnight while he traveled, told babysitters not to call Emily if there were problems, and had even suggested that Chloe might be better off in boarding school where she could learn some discipline. The attorney's words painted a picture of a man Margaret barely recognized, though now that she thought about it, the signs had been there all along. Daniel's quick temper, his impatience with normal childhood behavior, his tendency to treat Chloe more like an inconvenience than a daughter. Emily was planning to file for divorce after the holidays, Harold explained. She wanted to give Chloe one last normal Christmas before everything changed. But she was also practical enough to know that she needed to protect her daughter's future. He handed Margaret a legal document. She updated her will in July, and the provisions might surprise you. As Margaret read through the legal language, her eyes widened. Emily had left the family home and her substantial savings account directly to Chloe, with Margaret named as trustee until the child turned 18. Daniel was entitled only to his portion of his own business investments and the small joint checking account they'd maintained for household expenses. She specifically requested that if anything happened to her, Chloe should live with you, Harold added. She felt that Daniel, while not necessarily a bad person, was too focused on his business interests to provide the emotional support and stability a child needs. Margaret set the document down with trembling hands. "Harold, does Daniel know about this?" "Not yet. I was required to wait until after the funeral to schedule the reading of the will. I've sent him a letter requesting his presence here tomorrow afternoon, along with you as Chloe's designated guardian." Margaret's mind raced with the implications. Daniel had been behaving as if he would inherit everything, as if his primary concern was managing Emily's assets and determining Chloe's living arrangements. Tomorrow, he would discover that Emily had essentially cut him out of any significant inheritance and had chosen her mother over him to raise their daughter. "Harold," Margaret said slowly, "I think Daniel is going to be very, very angry." The elderly attorney nodded grimly. "Margaret, in my 40 years of practice, I've learned to recognize the signs of a contentious inheritance situation. This is all the makings of a real battle. The question is, are you prepared to fight for Chloe if Daniel contests the will?" Margaret thought about her granddaughter's fearful eyes, about Emily's desperate phone call, about the threat to send Chloe away if she continued grieving her mother. This touching family story was about to become a true family drama, and Margaret realized that her quiet life of gardening and church socials was about to be turned upside down. "Harold," she said with a determination that surprised them both, "I've already lost my husband and my daughter. I will not lose my granddaughter to a man who sees her as nothing more than an inconvenience to be managed." The next afternoon, Margaret sat in Harold Green's office feeling like she was waiting for a storm to hit. She'd arrived 15 minutes early, her hands folded tightly in her lap, trying to prepare herself for what was about to unfold. Through the tall windows, she could see Daniel's black BMW pulling into the parking space below, and her heart began to race. Daniel entered the office with his usual confident stride, wearing one of his expensive Navy suits and carrying a leather briefcase that probably cost more than Margaret's monthly grocery budget. He greeted Harold with a firm handshake and nodded politely to Margaret, but she noticed something different in his demeanor today. There was an eagerness in his eyes, an expectant energy that made her stomach turn. "I appreciate you both coming on such short notice," Harold began, settling behind his desk. "As you know, we're here for the formal reading of Emily's last will and testament. Before we begin, I want to remind you both that this document was prepared by Emily of her own free will, with full legal counsel, and was properly witnessed and notarized." Daniel leaned forward slightly, his businessman's instincts clearly engaged. Margaret could practically see him calculating numbers in his head, probably already making plans for Emily's assets. The inheritance drama that was about to unfold would shatter those calculations completely. Harold opened the file and began to read in his steady, professional voice. The first few paragraphs were standard legal language, but then he reached the heart of Emily's final wishes. "To my beloved husband Daniel, I leave the entirety of his business interests and investments that are solely in his name, as well as the funds in our joint checking account, totaling approximately $8,400. Daniel's confident expression began to falter. $8,000? That was barely enough to cover a month of expenses. "To my precious daughter Chloe," Harold continued, "I leave the house at 1247 Maple Street, including all contents and furnishings, as well as my personal savings account, investment portfolio, and life insurance policy, totaling approximately $340,000. These assets are to be held in trust, with my mother, Margaret Collins, serving as trustee and primary guardian until Chloe reaches the age of 18. The silence in the room was deafening. Margaret watched as the color drained from Daniel's face, his businessman's composure cracking like ice on a frozen pond. His hands gripped the arms of his chair, so tightly his knuckles turned white. "I'm sorry," Daniel said, his voice carefully controlled but with an edge that hadn't been there a moment before. "Could you repeat that last part?" Harold, who had clearly anticipated this reaction, repeated Emily's wishes word for word. Daniel sat in stunned silence for a long moment, then suddenly stood up and began pacing behind his chair. "This is ridiculous," he said, his voice rising slightly. "Emily wouldn't have done this without discussing it with me. We were married for 12 years. That house is half mine by law." "Actually, Daniel," Harold said gently, "Emily inherited that house from her grandmother before your marriage. Under Ohio law, it remained her separate property. She was free to dispose of it as she wished." Margaret watched this emotional grandmother story unfold with a mixture of sadness and growing alarm. She could see Daniel's massive grief and respectability sliding away, revealing something much less pleasant underneath. "And what about my daughter?" Daniel demanded. "I'm Chloe's father. I have rights." "Of course you do," Harold acknowledged. "Emily's will express her preference for Chloe's living arrangements, but custody matters would need to be resolved through the family court system if there's a disagreement." Daniel turned to face Margaret for the first time since the reading began, and she was struck by the coldness in his eyes. Gone was any pretense of the grieving husband seeking comfort from his deceased wife's mother. Instead, she saw calculation, anger, and something that looked disturbingly like contempt. "Margaret," he said in a voice that was eerily calm, "surely you can see that this arrangement isn't in anyone's best interest. I'm Chloe's father, and she belongs with me. I have the resources to provide for her properly, to give her opportunities you simply can't afford." "Daniel," Margaret replied carefully, "Emily made these decisions because she felt they were in Chloe's best interest. She knew her daughter better than anyone." Emily was clearly not thinking straight. Daniel snapped, his composure finally cracking completely. She was probably having some kind of breakdown. People don't just cut their husbands out of their wills for no reason. Harold cleared his throat diplomatically. "Daniel." Emily was quite specific about her reasoning. She left a sealed letter explaining her decisions, to be opened only if the will was contested. He held up a cream-colored envelope with Emily's familiar handwriting. "Would you like me to read it now, or would you prefer some time to consider your options?" The threat was clear, and Margaret could see Daniel weighing his choices. Whatever Emily had written in that letter, it was apparently serious enough that Harold was using it as leverage. This touching family story was revealing layers of deception and neglect that Margaret was only beginning to understand. "I don't need to hear Emily's dramatic explanations," Daniel said bitterly. "But I will not allow my daughter to be raised in poverty by an elderly woman who can barely take care of herself." Margaret felt a flash of anger at the insult, but Harold placed a gentle hand on her arm before she could respond. "Daniel," the attorney said firmly, "I'd suggest you take some time to think about the situation carefully. Contesting a will is a serious matter and can be quite expensive and emotionally devastating for everyone involved, especially a child who's already lost her mother." "Are you threatening me?" Daniel asked. "I'm simply pointing out the realities of the legal system," Harold replied evenly. "If you choose to contest this will, Emily's letter will become part of the public record. Every detail of your marriage, your parenting, and your personal conduct will be subject to scrutiny by the court." Margaret watched Daniel process this information, and she could practically see the wheels turning in his mind. He was a businessman, accustomed to calculating risks and benefits, and Harold had just made it clear that the potential costs of fighting might outweigh any possible gains. But then Daniel's expression hardened with a resolve that sent a chill down Margaret's spine. "Harold, you'll be hearing from my attorney. And Margaret," he turned to face her directly, "don't get too comfortable in your new role as guardian. I'm Chloe's father, and I will not be pushed aside by my dead wife's paranoia and her mother's interference." With that, he grabbed his briefcase and strode out of the office, leaving Margaret and Harold sitting in the aftermath of his anger. Through the window, Margaret watched him slam his car door and speed out of the parking lot. And she realized that this family betrayal story was about to become a battle for the most precious thing in her world, her granddaughter's future. The wisdom life lessons she was about to learn would test every ounce of strength she had left, and the child custody battle that lay ahead would determine whether love or money would ultimately win. That evening, Margaret sat at her kitchen table with a cup of chamomile tea growing cold in front of her, trying to process everything that had happened in Harold's office. Chloe was upstairs doing homework, blissfully unaware that her entire world had just shifted again. The child had already lost her mother. Now she was caught in the middle of an inheritance drama that she was too young to understand but old enough to be hurt by. Margaret's phone rang, startling her from her thoughts. She glanced at the caller ID and saw Daniel's name. For a moment, she considered not answering, but something told her she needed to hear what he had to say. "Margaret." Daniel's voice was different now, stripped of the false warmth he'd maintained since Emily's death. "We need to talk." "About what, Daniel?" Margaret kept her voice steady, though her heart was racing. "About this ridiculous situation Emily has created. Look, I understand you're grieving, and maybe you think having Chloe will help fill the void, but let's be realistic here. You're 68 years old. You live on Social Security and Robert's small pension. What kind of life can you really provide for a growing child?" Margaret felt her temper rising, but she forced herself to remain calm. "Daniel, I raised Emily just fine, and she turned out to be a wonderful mother in person. I may not have your money, but I have something more important." "And what's that?" he asked, his tone dismissive. "I have love for that child that doesn't come with conditions or expectations. I don't see her as an inconvenience or an obligation." There was a long pause, and when Daniel spoke again, his voice was cold. "You don't know what you're talking about, Margaret. You have no idea what it's like to be a single parent trying to build a business, try and provide security for the future. Emily never understood the pressure I was under." "The pressure you were under?" Margaret couldn't keep the disbelief out of her voice. "Daniel, you were having an affair while your wife was home raising your daughter." The silence on the other end of the line was telling. Finally, Daniel spoke, and the pretense was completely gone now. "Emily told you about that, did she? Or did you hire some private investigator? It doesn't matter. What happened between Emily and me is between Emily and me. It has nothing to do with Chloe." "It has everything to do with Chloe," Margaret replied firmly. "That little girl watched your parents' marriage fall apart. She heard the arguments, felt the tension, lived with the consequences of your choices." "My choices?" Daniel's voice rose angrily. "Emily was the one who shut me out, who turned cold and distant. She buried herself in her books and her library job, acted like she was too good for the life I was trying to build for our family. Do you have any idea how frustrating it is to live with someone who makes you feel like nothing you do is ever enough? Margaret listened to this emotional grandmother story unfold with a growing sense of understanding. This wasn't really about money or custody. This was about control, about Daniel's inability to accept that Emily had finally found the courage to protect herself and her daughter from his selfishness. "Daniel," she said quietly, "if Emily shut you out, maybe it was because you gave her reasons not to trust you." Trust. Daniel laughed bitterly. "She trusted you more than she trusted her own husband. Did you know she called you more than she called me in the last year of her life? Did you know she made her important decisions and then informed me about them like I was some kind of stranger?" As painful as it was to hear, Margaret realized Daniel was revealing more truth than he probably intended. Emily had been pulling away from him, but not out of coldness or indifference. She'd been protecting herself and Chloe from a man who saw his family as accessories to his success rather than people to be cherished and protected. "Maybe she called me because I listened without trying to control her," Margaret suggested gently. "Control her?" Daniel's voice exploded through the phone. "I never controlled Emily. I suggested, I advised. I tried to guide our family toward financial security and social advancement. But she wanted to stay in her little bubble, content with her small town life and her minimum wage library job." There it was, Margaret thought. Daniel's real feelings about Emily's choices, about the life she'd built for herself and Chloe. He'd been ashamed of her, resentful of her contentment with things that mattered more than money and status. "Daniel," Margaret said, "Chloe is happy with me. She's grieving her mother, but she feels safe here. Isn't that what matters most right now?" "What matters," Daniel said sharply, "is that I'm not going to let my dead wife's paranoid fantasies dictate my daughter's future. Emily filled that child's head with lies about me, made her afraid of her own father. But I can fix that, given time." A chill ran down Margaret's spine. "What do you mean, fix that?" "I mean Chloe needs to learn that I'm her father, and fathers make the decisions in families. She needs structure, discipline, respect for authority. Emily was too soft, too permissive. She raised Chloe to question everything, to think her opinions matter as much as adults." Margaret thought about her granddaughter's bright curiosity, her thoughtful questions, her gentle spirit that was so much like Emily's. The idea of Daniel trying to break that spirit, to mold Chloe into his vision of an obedient daughter, made her stomach turn. "Daniel, Chloe is a 10-year-old child who just lost her mother. She doesn't need discipline. She needs comfort and stability. She needs a father who won't coddle her the way Emily did, the way you're doing now. Look, Margaret, I'm going to get custody of my daughter, one way or another. Emily's one might complicate things financially, but no court is going to leave a child with a grandmother when her father is capable of caring for her." Capable? Margaret couldn't help herself. "Daniel, when was the last time you helped Chloe with her homework? When was the last time you attended one of her school events or tucked her in at night?" "I was building a business," Daniel shouted. "I was working 18-hour days to provide for my family, to build something substantial for Chloe's future. Not everyone can afford to be a stay-at-home grandmother with nothing better to do than bake cookies and tell bedtime stories." Margaret realized that this conversation had revealed everything she needed to know about Daniel's true character. This inspiring elderly story was becoming a battle between two very different definitions of what it meant to love a child. For Margaret, love meant presence, attention, putting Chloe's emotional needs first. For Daniel, love was apparently something that could be purchased with success and demonstrated through control. "Daniel," she said quietly, "I think you should know that I'm going to fight for Chloe. Emily trusted me with her most precious gift, and I won't let her down." "Then I guess we'll see each other in court," Daniel replied coldly. "But Margaret, don't underestimate me. I have resources you can't imagine, and I will not lose my daughter to an old woman's sentimentality." The line went dead, and Margaret sat in her quiet kitchen, understanding that the real battle for Chloe's future was just beginning. The next few days passed in an uneasy quiet that reminded Margaret of the still air before a tornado. Chloe went to school, came home to Margaret's house, did her homework at the same kitchen table where her mother had once studied, and seemed to be adjusting as well as could be expected. But Margaret could see the worry in her granddaughter's eyes. the way the child watched the phone, whenever it rang, the questions she didn't quite dare to ask. On Thursday morning, Margaret was hanging laundry on the line in her backyard when she noticed a man in a dark sedan parked across the street, taking pictures of her house. When she walked the front yard to get a better look, the car pulled away. That afternoon, Chloe's teacher, Mrs. Patterson, called to say that someone claiming to be a family friend had tried to check Chloe out of school early, but since the person wasn't on the approved pickup list, they had refused. Margaret's hands were shaking when she called Harold Green. "He's having you watched," Harold said grimly after she described the incidents, "and testing your security measures." "Margaret, I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. Are you absolutely certain you want to go through with this custody battle? Because if Daniel is already playing hardball, it's only going to get worse." Margaret looked through her kitchen window at Chloe, who was curled up on the living room sofa reading one of the books from Emily's childhood collection. The child looked so small, so vulnerable, so much like Emily at that age. This touching family story had become something far more serious than a simple disagreement about living arrangements. "Harold, what happens to Chloe if I back down? What happens if I let Daniel have custody just to avoid a fight?" "Honestly, I don't know. Daniel has legal rights as her father, and if he's not actually abusive or neglectful in ways that can be proven in court, he'll probably get custody regardless of Emily's wishes." "But you've seen Emily's letter. What did she say about him?" Harold was quiet for a moment. "Margaret, Emily documented some concerning behavior, but nothing that rises to the level of abuse that would automatically disqualify Daniel from custody. Emotional neglect is hard to prove, and the court system tends to favor biological parents unless there's clear evidence of danger." Margaret felt a familiar tightness in her chest, the same feeling she'd had when the doctors told her Robert's cancer had spread, that sense of fighting a battle where the odds were stacked against her from the beginning. "But Harold, surely the court will consider what Emily wanted for her daughter?" "They'll consider it, but it's not binding. Emily could express her preferences in her will. But custody decisions are made based on what the court determines is in the child's best interest, not necessarily what the deceased parent wanted." That evening, after Chloe had gone to bed, Margaret called her sister Clara in Phoenix. Clara was 3 years younger and had always been the practical one in the family, the one who saw situations clearly without getting caught up in emotions. "Clara, I need your honest opinion about something," Margaret began, and then laid out the entire situation. Emily's death, the will, Daniel's behavior, and the looming custody battle. Clara listened without interrupting, and when Margaret finished, there was a long silence. "Maggie," Clara said finally, using Margaret's childhood nickname, "I have to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with yourself. Are you fighting for Chloe because it's what's best for her, or are you fighting because losing her will be like losing Emily all over again?" Margaret felt like she'd been slapped. "Clara, how can you ask me that?" "Because I know you and I know how much you've lost. First Robert, then Emily, and now you're facing the possibility of losing your granddaughter too. It would be natural to want to hold on to the only family you have left." Margaret was quiet for a moment, forcing herself to really consider Clara's question. Was this about her own need to protect what remained of her family, or was it truly about Chloe's welfare? "Clara, you should see how that child looks at her father. She's afraid of him. Not terrified, not obviously abused, but afraid of disappointing him, afraid of being too much trouble, afraid of being sent away. Emily saw it too, and that's why she made the choices she did." "Then you have your answer," Clara said gently. "But Maggie, you need to understand what you're getting into. Daniel sounds like a man who's used to getting his way, and he's got money and connections. This isn't going to be a fair fight." After they hung up, Margaret sat in her quiet living room, thinking about Clara's words. She'd spent her entire adult life avoiding confrontation, being the peacemaker, the one who smoothed over family disagreements and kept everyone happy. Even during Robert's illness, she'd been the one who managed his care quietly, efficiently, without drama or demand for attention. But this was different. This was about protecting a child who couldn't protect herself, about honoring her daughter's final wishes, about standing up to a man who seemed to view his own daughter as a possession to be managed rather than a person to be loved. The next morning, Margaret was surprised to find Chloe already awake, when she went to start the coffee. The child was sitting at the kitchen table in her pajamas, staring out the window at the maple tree that was beginning to turn brilliant shades of red and gold. "Couldn't sleep, sweetheart?" Margaret asked gently, settling into the chair beside her granddaughter. "Grandma Margaret," Chloe said without turning away from the window, "are you and Daddy going to have a fight about where I live?" Margaret's heart sank. She'd hoped to shield Chloe from the worst of what was happening, but children were more perceptive than adults often gave them credit for. "Sweet pea, your daddy and I both love you very much, and we both want what's best for you. Sometimes adults disagree about what that means." Chloe finally turned to look at her grandmother, and Margaret was struck by how much older the child seemed than she had just a few weeks ago. Grief had a way of aging people, even children. "I heard him on the phone yesterday," Chloe said quietly. "Daddy was talking to someone about lawyers and courts and taking me away from you." Her voice broke on the last words, and Margaret pulled her granddaughter into her arms. "Oh, sweetheart, I'm so sorry you heard that. You shouldn't have to worry about these grown-up problems." "But I do worry," Chloe whispered against Margaret's shoulder. "I don't want to leave you, Grandma Margaret. I want to stay here where it smells like Mommy's perfume and where her books are still on the shelves. Daddy's house doesn't feel like home." Margaret held her granddaughter tighter, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders like a heavy blanket. This emotional grandmother story was about to become a fight for everything that mattered, and she knew there was no turning back now. "Chloe, I want you to know something important. No matter what happens, no matter where you end up living, you will always be loved. Your mommy loved you, I love you, and even your daddy loves you, even if he doesn't always show it the way you need him to. But will you fight for me?" Chloe asked, pulling back to look into Margaret's eyes. "Will you try to keep me here?" Margaret looked at her granddaughter's earnest face and made a promise that would change both their lives forever. "Yes, sweet pea. I will fight for you with everything I have." Within a week of that conversation, Margaret received a thick envelope from Whitman, Bradley and Associates, one of Columbus's most prestigious law firms. Her hands trembled as she opened it, already knowing what she would find inside. Daniel had filed for sole custody of Chloe, and the legal language was cold and clinical in its assault on Margaret's fitness as a guardian. The petition painted a picture of Margaret as an elderly woman whose advanced age and limited resources made her unsuitable to care for a growing child. It claimed that Chloe needed the stability and opportunities that only her father could provide, and that Emily's wishes, while understandable from a grieving mother, were not in the child's best interests. But it was the personal attacks that cut deepest. The document suggested that Margaret was manipulating Chloe's emotions, turning the child against her father out of her own grief and loneliness. It implied that keeping Chloe in Margaret's care would be a disservice to the child's development and future prospects. Harold Green read through a petition with the grim expression of someone who had seen this kind of character assassination before. "Margaret, I'm not going to sugarcoat this. Daniel has hired one of the best family law attorneys in the state. Susan Bradley has a reputation for being thorough, aggressive, and expensive. What does that mean for us?" Margaret asked, though she was afraid she already knew the answer. "It means they're going to investigate every aspect of your life, looking for anything they can use against you. Your health, your finances, your social connections, your parenting history with Emily. Everything will be scrutinized." Margaret felt a familiar flutter of anxiety in her chest. "Harold, I'm not perfect. I made mistakes raising Emily, just like every parent does. What if they find something? Then we deal with it honestly and put in context," Harold replied. "But Margaret, I need you to understand something. This isn't just about Chloe anymore. This is about Daniel's pride, his need to control the narrative of his marriage and his family. Emily's was a public rejection of him as a husband and father, and he can't let that stand." Over the next few weeks, the true family drama began to unfold in ways Margaret had never imagined. A social worker named Jennifer Martinez was assigned to evaluate both households and make a recommendation to the court. She was a professional woman in her 30s with kind eyes, but a clipboard full of questions that felt invasive and judgmental. Mrs. Collins, Ms. Martinez said during her first visit to Margaret's house, "I need to ask about your long-term health and your ability to keep up with an active 10-year-old. Do you have any medical conditions I should be aware of? Margaret explained about her arthritis, which occasionally made her hands stiff in the mornings, and her mild high blood pressure, which was well controlled with medication. She showed Ms. Martinez around her small but tidy house, the bedroom she prepared for Chloe with Emily's childhood furniture, the kitchen where she'd been cooking family meals for decades. And what about your social support system? The social worker continued. Parenting can be isolating, especially for someone in your situation. Margaret talked about her church family, her neighbors who had known her for 20 years, her sister Clara, who called twice a week from Phoenix. But even as she spoke, she could see Ms. Martinez taking notes, probably calculating whether a 68-year-old woman with arthritis and high blood pressure was really the best choice for raising a young child. The visit to Daniel's house, which Margaret heard about through Harold, painted a very different picture. Daniel lived in a sprawling colonial in one of Columbus's most affluent suburbs, with a 3-car garage, a swimming pool, and Chloe's own bedroom decorated with expensive furniture and every toy a child could want. He could afford private schools, music lessons, summer camps, opportunities that Margaret's fixed income could never provide. But this inspiring elderly story wasn't really about money or material advantages. It was about something deeper, something that became clear during Chloe's interview with Ms. Martinez. Margaret wasn't allowed to be present during that conversation, but Harold had arranged for her to receive a summary of the social worker's findings. What she read broke her heart and strengthened her resolve at the same time. When asked where she felt safest and happiest, Chloe had said, "At Grandma Margaret's house, because she lets me talk about Mommy and she doesn't get angry when I cry." When asked about her relationship with her father, Chloe had been careful and diplomatic in a way that children learn to be when they're afraid of saying the wrong thing. "Daddy works very hard and he wants me to be good. He says I should be grateful for everything he gives me." But it was Chloe's response to a question about her future that revealed the most. "I want to live with Grandma Margaret because she loves me the way Mommy did, without me having to earn it." Margaret read that line over and over, tears streaming down her face. A 10-year-old child shouldn't have to think about earning love, shouldn't have to worry about being good enough to deserve affection and acceptance. That Chloe understood the difference between conditional and unconditional love said everything about the kind of household she'd been living in with Daniel. But understanding the emotional truth of the situation and proving it in court were two different things. Susan Bradley, Daniel's attorney, was already building a case that focused on practical considerations rather than emotional ones. She had Margaret's medical records subpoenaed, questioned her financial stability, and even interviewed neighbors about whether Margaret had the energy and capability to supervise an active child. The most painful part came when Bradley's team began investigating Margaret's parenting of Emily. They dug up her school records, talked to Emily's former teachers, and even contacted some of Emily's college friends, apparently looking for evidence that Margaret had been an inadequate mother whose daughter had suffered as a result. "Harold," Margaret said during one of their weekly meetings, "they're trying to make it sound like I failed Emily somehow, like her problems with Daniel were my fault for not raising her properly." "That's exactly what they're doing," Harold confirmed. "It's a common tactic in custody cases. Attack the character and competence of the opposing party by suggesting they've already failed as a parent once." Margaret felt the weight of decades of second-guessing herself. Every mistake she'd made raising Emily, every time she'd been too tired or too stressed or too overwhelmed to be the perfect mother she wanted to be, now felt like ammunition in Daniel's war against her. But then she remembered Emily's final phone call, the trust in her daughter's voice when she'd asked Margaret to take care of Chloe. Emily hadn't seen her mother as a failure. She'd seen her as the person she trusted most in the world to protect her child. "Harold," Margaret said with growing determination, "what do we need to do to win this case?" Harold looked at her seriously. "Margaret, we need to prove that despite your age and limited resources, you can provide Chloe with something Daniel can't. A home where she's valued for who she is, not what she achieves. We need to show that love and stability matter more than money and opportunity." It sounded simple when he said it, but Margaret was beginning to understand that this child custody battle would test not just resolve, but everything she believed about family, love, and what it truly meant to protect a child. 3 weeks before the custody hearing was scheduled to begin, Margaret made a discovery that would change everything. She had been going through Emily's personal belongings, finally finding the emotional strength to sort through her daughter's clothes and papers, when she found a small key taped under the bottom drawer of Emily's jewelry box. Margaret stared at the key for a long moment, wondering what it might unlock. Emily had always been methodical, the kind of person who labeled storage boxes and kept important papers in clearly marked files. This hidden key suggested something Emily hadn't wanted anyone to find easily. After searching through the house systematically, Margaret finally discovered what the key unlocked: a small fireproof safe hidden behind Emily's winter coats in the bedroom closet. Inside, she found a manila folder containing documents that made her stomach drop and her heart race simultaneously. The folder held printed emails between Daniel and someone named Rebecca Turner, dating back almost 2 years. The messages started professionally. Rebecca was apparently the marketing manager for Daniel's newest dealership. But they quickly became personal, then intimate, then downright shocking in their casual cruelty toward Emily and Chloe. In one email from just 6 months before Emily's death, Daniel had written, "Emily is being impossible about the vacation house idea. She acts like spending money on nice things is some kind of sin. I swear she'd be happy living in a trailer as long as she had her precious books." Rebecca's response was even worse. "Maybe it's time to think about whether this marriage is worth saving. You're young, successful, and let's face it, you could do a lot better than a small-town librarian with no social connections." But it was the emails about Chloe that made Margaret's hand shake with anger. Daniel had written, "Sometimes I think Chloe would be better off in boarding school. Emily has made her too soft, too emotional. The kid cries if you look at her wrong, and she asks too many questions about everything." Margaret read through email after email, each one revealing more about Daniel's true feelings toward his family. He complained about the cost of Chloe's piano lessons, about having to attend her school plays, about the way Emily babied their daughter instead of teaching her to be more independent. In one particularly damning exchange, Rebecca had suggested that Daniel could probably get sole custody if Emily were out of the picture, and Daniel had responded, "Don't think I haven't considered it. Emily would never agree to joint custody, but if something happened to her, I'd have a lot more options." Margaret felt sick reading those words. The casual way Daniel discussed the possibility of Emily being gone, the practical calculations about custody arrangements, it painted a picture of a man who saw his wife's death not as a tragedy, but as an opportunity. But the folder contained more than just emails. Emily had also documented incidents that showed Daniel's neglect and inappropriate behavior as a father. There were copies of school forms that Emily had to forge Daniel's signature on because he refused to take time off work for parent conferences. There were receipts showing that Emily paid for all of Chloe's school supplies, clothes, and activities from her own modest salary, while Daniel spent thousands on golf equipment and business trips. Most damning of all was a series of photographs Emily had taken to their home after one of Daniel's angry outbursts. A broken lamp, a hole punched in the wall of Chloe's bedroom, a shattered picture frame that held a photo of Emily and Chloe at the zoo. Emily had documented the physical evidence of Daniel's temper, his inability to control himself when things didn't go his way. At the bottom of the folder was a letter in Emily's handwriting, dated just 2 months before her death. "If anyone is reading this, it means something has happened to me and Chloe needs protection. Daniel is not the father he appears to be in public. He has never hit Chloe, but he has broken things in front of her when he's angry. He has left her alone overnight on multiple occasions. He sees her as a burden and an expense rather than a child to be loved and protected. I am documenting these things not to hurt Daniel, but to protect Chloe. She deserves to grow up in a home where she feels safe and valued. If something happens to me, I trust my mother to fight for Chloe's well-being, even if it means using this information against her father. Daniel is not evil, but he is selfish and immature in ways that make him dangerous to a child's emotional development. Chloe has already started to withdraw from him, to become anxious and apologetic around him. I cannot let that continue." Margaret sat on Emily's bedroom floor, surrounded by the evidence of her daughter's final desperate attempts to protect her child, and wept. This emotional grandmother story had revealed truths that were both heartbreaking and empowering. Emily had been fighting to save Chloe long before her death. Now it was Margaret's turn to continue that fight. She called Harold immediately, her voice shaking with emotion and determination. "Harold, I need to see you right away. I found something that changes everything." Within an hour, Harold was sitting in Margaret's living room, reading through Emily's hidden documentation with the careful attention of someone who understood its legal significance. "Margaret," he said finally, "this is exactly what we needed." These emails showed Daniel's true character, his lack of commitment to his family, his relationship with Rebecca Turner. The documentation Emily kept proves a pattern of neglect and emotional volatility. "But Harold," Margaret asked, "will the court accept this? Can we use Emily's evidence even though she's not here to testify about it?" "Some of it, yes. The emails are digital evidence that can be authenticated. The photographs Emily took are documentary evidence of Daniel's behavior. Her written observations might be more difficult to introduce, but we have options." Margaret felt a surge of hope mixed with sadness. Emily had been preparing for this battle even before her death, trying to build a case that would protect Chloe from a father who saw her as an inconvenience rather than a blessing. "There's something else," Harold said, still reading through the documents. These emails mention Daniel moving money to offshore accounts, possibly to hide assets from Emily in case of divorce. "If we can prove financial deception, it strengthens our case significantly." That evening, Margaret sat with Chloe in the living room, watching her granddaughter work on a school project about family trees. The child was carefully drawing branches and writing names, creating a visual representation of the people who had shaped her young life. "Grandma Margaret," Chloe said, looking up from her poster board, "my teacher said we should include people who love us, not just people who are related to us. Can I put you at the top of my tree instead of Daddy?" Margaret's heart broke and soared at the same time. This touching family story was about to reach its climax in a courtroom, but the real battle had already been won in the heart of a 10-year-old girl who understood the difference between being claimed and being loved. "Sweetheart," Margaret said gently, "you can put anyone on that tree who makes you feel safe and loved. That's what real family means." As Chloe bent back over her project, carefully writing Grandma Margaret in large letters at the center of her family tree, Margaret understood that they were about to face the fight of their lives. But they were also about to discover just how powerful the bond between a grandmother and her granddaughter could be when everything else fell away. The custody hearing began on a gray November morning that seemed to match the somber mood in the courthouse. Margaret sat beside Harold at the plaintiff's table, her hands folded tightly in her lap, trying to project the calm confidence she didn't feel. Across the aisle, Daniel sat with his high-powered attorney Susan Bradley, looking every inch a successful businessman in his tailored suit and confident demeanor. Judge Patricia Henley presided over the courtroom with the no-nonsense authority of someone who had seen every kind of family dispute imaginable. She was a woman in her 50s with steel gray hair and sharp eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. Bradley began the proceedings by painting Daniel as a devoted father who had been unfairly shut out of important decisions about his daughter's welfare. She emphasized his financial stability, his business success, and his ability to provide Chloe with educational and social opportunities that Margaret simply couldn't match. "Your Honor," Bradley said in her crisp, professional voice, "while we sympathize with Mrs. Collins' grief and her desire to maintain a connection with her granddaughter, the facts are clear. Mr. Prescott is Chloe's natural father. He has stable housing and income, and he is fully capable of providing for his daughter's needs. Mrs. Collins, while well-intentioned, is 68 years old with limited resources and health issues that make her an unsuitable primary guardian for a growing child." Margaret listened to Bradley's opening statement with growing alarm. The attorney made her sound like a frail old woman clinging to her granddaughter out of loneliness and desperation. She made Daniel sound like a victim of his wife's irrational fears and his mother-in-law's interference. But then Harold stood up for his opening statement, and Margaret felt a surge of hope. "Your Honor," Harold began, "this case isn't about money or age or social standing. It's about what Emily Prescott, a loving mother who knew both parties intimately, believed was best for her daughter. Emily didn't make her custody preferences lightly. She had reasons, documented reasons, for believing that her daughter would be safer and happier with her grandmother." Over the next 2 days, the court heard testimony from character witnesses on both sides. Daniel's colleagues testified about his business acumen and community involvement. Margaret's neighbors and church friends spoke about her kindness, her devotion to Chloe, and the loving home she had provided for Emily. But the real drama began when Harold introduced Emily's hidden documentation into evidence. "Your Honor," Harold said, "I'd like to present Exhibit a series of emails between Mr. Prescott and Ms. Rebecca Turner, dating from 18 months before Emily's death to just weeks before the accident." Bradley immediately objected, claiming the emails were private communications obtained without proper authorization. But Judge Henley allowed them into evidence as part of Emily's documented concerns about her husband's fitness as a parent. As Harold read selected passages from the emails, Margaret watched Daniel's confident facade begin to crack. The casual cruelty of his words about Emily, the dismissive comment about Chloe, the clear evidence of his long-term affair, all of it painted a picture very different from the devoted husband and father he claimed to be. "Mr. Prescott," Harold said, reading from one particularly damaging email. "You wrote to Miss Turner, and I quote, 'Sometimes I think Chloe would be better off in boarding school. Emily has made her too soft, too emotional.' Can you explain what you meant by that?" Daniel's attorney coached him through a response about wanting his daughter to be strong and independent, but the damage was done. The courtroom had heard his own words revealing his impatience with normal childhood emotions and his desire to send his 10-year-old daughter away. But the most damaging testimony came from an unexpected source. Rebecca Turner herself took the stand, called by Harold as a witness. Margaret was surprised to see a woman in her early 30s with auburn hair and nervous eyes, clearly uncomfortable with being thrust into the spotlight. "Ms. Turner," Harold said gently, "you've been in a relationship with Mr. Prescott for approximately 2 years. Is that correct?" "Yes," Rebecca answered quietly. "During that time, did Mr. Prescott ever discuss his feelings about his marriage and his role as a father?" Rebecca glanced at Daniel, then looked away. "He sometimes expressed frustration about his family situation, yes. Can you be more specific?" Rebecca took a deep breath, and Margaret could see her struggling with her conscience. Daniel often said that Emily was holding him back, that she was too content with their simple lifestyle. He felt that she was raising Chloe to be too dependent and emotional. Did he ever suggest that his family would be better off without him? Bradley objected, but Judge Henley allowed the question. "Not exactly," Rebecca said carefully, "but he did say that if he were ever free to start over, he could provide a better life for Chloe with more discipline and structure." The courtroom was silent as the implications of her words sank in. Harold pressed further. "Ms. Turner, did Mr. Prescott ever discuss the possibility of his wife's death and how it might affect his custody situation?" This time Rebecca's answer came in a whisper. "He said once that if anything ever happened to Emily, he would make sure Chloe learned to respect him as her father." Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. The casual way Daniel had discussed Emily's potential absence, the calculating tone Rebecca described, it painted a picture of a man who had already considered life without his wife as an improvement. But the most powerful testimony came from Chloe herself. Judge Henley had arranged for the 10-year-old to be interviewed privately in her chambers, away from both parties, with only a court-appointed child advocate present. When Judge Henley returned to the courtroom after that interview, her expression was grave. She called both attorneys to the bench for a private conference that lasted nearly 15 minutes. Margaret watched anxiously as the lawyers whispered urgently with the judge, their faces growing more serious by the moment. Finally, Judge Henley returned to her seat and addressed the courtroom. "Ladies and gentlemen, I've had the opportunity to speak privately with Chloe Prescott about her preferences and feelings regarding this custody arrangement. While I won't share the details of that conversation to protect the child's privacy, I will say that her statements have been quite illuminating." Margaret's heart was pounding so hard, she was sure everyone in the courtroom could hear it. Everything they had fought for, everything Emily had hoped for, now rested in the hands of this judge who held the power to determine Chloe's future. "Before I render my decision," Judge Henley continued, "I want to address something that has become clear during these proceedings. This case is not simply about two adults disagreeing about what's best for a child. This case reveals a pattern of emotional neglect and manipulation that has already caused significant harm to this 10-year-old girl." Margaret saw Daniel stiffen in his chair, his lawyer placing a warning hand on his arm. "The court has heard evidence of Mr. Prescott's long-term infidelity, his dismissive attitude toward his daughter's emotional needs, and his casual discussions about sending her away when her normal childhood responses became inconvenient for him. We've also heard testimony suggesting that Mr. Prescott viewed his wife's death not as a tragedy, but as an opportunity to restructure his family according to his preferences. The judge's words hung in the air like an indictment, and Margaret realized that this inspiring elderly story was about to reach its climax. But first, Daniel himself was about to reveal the true depth of his character in a way that would shock everyone in that courtroom. What happened next would be talked about in legal circles for years to come. Judge Henley had just finished her scathing assessment of Daniel's character when she made a simple statement that would trigger the most dramatic moment of the entire custody battle. "Mr. Prescott," she said, "before I render my final decision, I'm going to give you one last opportunity to address the court. Is there anything you'd like to say about your fitness as a father and your plans for Chloe's care?" Daniel stood up, and Margaret could see something dangerous flickering in his eyes. His attorney, Susan Bradley, tried to whisper something to him, but he brushed her off with a sharp gesture. For 2 days, he had been forced to sit quietly while his private emails were read aloud, while his mistress testified about his callous statements, while his reputation was systematically dismantled. Now, finally, he had a chance to speak, and his fury was about to boil over. "Your Honor," Daniel began, his voice tight with controlled anger, "I've sat here for 2 days listening to my character assassinated by people who don't understand the pressure of being the sole provider for a family. Yes, I had an affair. Yes, I sometimes express frustration about my marriage and my daughter's behavior, but that doesn't make me unfit to be a parent." Judge Henley listened with the neutral expression of someone who had heard these justifications countless times before. "My wife, Emily, was a wonderful person," Daniel continued, his voice rising slightly, "but she had no ambition, no drive to better herself or our family circumstances. She was content to work at a minimum wage library job and live in that cramped little house, while I was building something substantial for our future." Margaret could feel the temperature in the courtroom changing. Daniel's mask of respectability was slipping, revealing something ugly underneath. And now, Daniel's voice was getting louder, more aggressive. "This court is suggesting that I should lose my daughter to an elderly woman who can barely support herself, just because my dead wife had some paranoid fantasies about my parenting?" Bradley was frankly trying to get Daniel's attention, to signal him to stop talking, but he was beyond listening to legal advice now. "Emily turned my own daughter against me," Daniel continued, his face flushing red with anger. "She filled Chloe's head with lies, made her afraid of normal parental discipline, taught her that emotions and feelings were more important than respect and obedience." Judge Henley's expression was hardening, but Daniel was too caught up in his rant to notice. "I am Chloe's father," he shouted, slamming his hand on the table. "I have rights that don't disappear just because an old woman and her lawyers want to play on this court's sympathy." The courtroom was dead silent except for Daniel's heavy breathing. Even his own attorney was staring at him in horror. But Daniel wasn't finished. "You want to know the truth, Your Honor? The truth is that maybe Chloe would be better off in boarding school, where she could learn some discipline and stop this constant crying and neediness that Emily encouraged. The truth is that I never wanted to be tied down to a small-town life with a woman who had no vision beyond her precious books and her overprotected daughter." Margaret felt sick listening to Daniel's words, but she also felt a strange sense of vindication. Emily had been right about her husband. Every concern she'd documented, every fear she'd expressed, was being validated by Daniel's own mouth. "The truth is," Daniel continued, his voice now loud enough that people in the hallway could probably hear him, "that Emily's death was probably the best thing that could have happened to both me and Chloe. Now I can raise my daughter properly, without interference from a woman who wanted to keep us both trapped in her mediocre little world." The gasp that went up from the courtroom was audible. Margaret felt tears streaming down her face, not just for Emily, but for Chloe, who might someday learn that her father had called her mother's death the best thing that could have happened. But Daniel still wasn't done. His final words would seal his fate and reveal the true depth of his character. "And if this court thinks it's going to take my daughter away from me and give her to that interfering old woman," he said, pointing directly at Margaret, "you're going to find out just how much fight I have in me. I will appeal this decision. I will drag this family through every court in Ohio, and I will make sure that woman never has a moment's peace as long as she thinks she can steal my child from me." The threat was clear, and the venom in Daniel's voice, as he said it, made Margaret's blood run cold. Judge Henley had heard enough. "Mr. Prescott," she said, her voice sharp as ice, "sit down immediately, or I will have you removed from this courtroom." Daniel finally seemed to realize what he had done. His attorney was pulling at his sleeve. Other people in the courtroom were staring at him in shock, and Judge Henley was looking at him with the kind of cold fury that could destroy lives. He sat down heavily, his face pale as he began to understand that his outburst had just cost him everything he claimed to be fighting for. Judge Henley took a moment to compose herself, then addressed the courtroom with the gravity of someone making a decision that would echo through multiple lives. "In 30 years on the bench," she began, "I have rarely seen such a clear demonstration of unfitness for parenthood as I have witnessed in this courtroom today. Mr. Prescott, your own words have revealed that you view your daughter not as a child to be loved and nurtured, but as property to be controlled. Your casual dismissal of your wife's death is beneficial. Your threats against Mrs. Collins and your fundamental lack of understanding about what children need emotionally have made this court's decision very easy." Margaret held her breath, hardly daring to hope. This court grants full legal custody of Chloe Prescott to her grandmother, Margaret Collins, effective immediately. Mr. Prescott will be allowed supervised visitation once monthly, contingent upon completion of anger management counseling and parenting classes. The courtroom erupted in a mixture of gasps, murmurs, and quiet applause from Margaret's supporters. Margaret herself felt like she might faint from relief and overwhelming emotion, but Judge Henley wasn't finished. Furthermore, given Mr. Prescott's threats against Mrs. Collins and his demonstrated volatility, this court is issuing a restraining order prohibiting him from coming within 500 feet of Mrs. Collins' residence or Chloe's school. As the gavel fell, Margaret realized that this child custody battle was finally over. But the real work of healing a wounded family was just beginning. She had won the legal fight, but now she had to help Chloe understand that she was truly safe, truly wanted, and truly home. 3 months after the custody hearing, Margaret stood in her kitchen on a snow-covered February morning, watching Chloe at the breakfast table working on her math homework with a kind of focused concentration that reminded her so much of Emily at that age. The child had grown 2 inches since coming to live permanently with her grandmother, and more importantly, the fearful, anxious expression that had haunted her eyes for so long was finally beginning to fade. "Grandma Margaret," Chloe said, looking up from her multiplication problems, "Mrs. Patterson wants to know if you can come to our class presentation next week. We're doing reports on people who inspire us, and I wrote mine about you." Margaret felt her eyes fill with tears, the good kind that came from overwhelming gratitude rather than grief. "Of course I can come, sweetheart. I wouldn't miss it for the world." This touching family story had taken so many unexpected turns, but sitting in her warm kitchen with her granddaughter safe and thriving, Margaret finally felt like they had reached the happy ending Emily had dreamed of for her daughter. The months following the custody battle hadn't been easy. Daniel had initially threatened to appeal the court's decision, but his attorney had eventually convinced him that his courtroom outbursts had damaged his case beyond repair. The supervised visitation sessions had been awkward and strained, with Chloe politely but distantly interacting with the father who had tried to take her away from the grandmother she loved. Eventually, Daniel's visits became less frequent, then stopped altogether. Margaret heard through Harold that Daniel had relocated to Atlanta, where Rebecca Turner had been offered promotion with her marketing company. He sent birthday cards and Christmas presents, expensive gifts that seemed more like obligations and expressions of love, but he made no effort to maintain a meaningful relationship with his daughter. Margaret worried sometimes about how this abandonment would affect Chloe in the long run, but the child seemed to accept her father's absence with a maturity that broke Margaret's heart even as it made her proud. "I think Daddy loves me," Chloe had said one evening when Margaret gently asked how she felt about not seeing her father anymore. "But I don't think he knows how to love me the way I need. And that's okay because you do." The wisdom life lessons that emerged from their experience together had shaped both grandmother and granddaughter in unexpected ways. Margaret had discovered a strength and determination she never knew she possessed, while Chloe had learned that love didn't always come from the places you expected it to, but was no less real or powerful because of that. On a warm day in May, exactly 8 months after Emily's death, Margaret and Chloe made a pilgrimage that had become sacred to them both. They drove to Riverside Cemetery, where Emily was buried beneath a simple granite headstone that read, "Beloved daughter and mother, 1983 to 2023. They brought fresh flowers, daffodils from Margaret's garden that Emily had planted herself 2 springs ago, and settled on the blanket they always brought for their cemetery visits. These weren't sad occasions anymore. They had become opportunities to feel connected to Emily, to share news and memories, and to maintain the bond that death couldn't break. Mama," Chloe said, addressing the headstone with the easy familiarity of a child who had learned that love continues even when physical presence ends. "I made the honor roll again this semester, and Grandma Margaret says you would be proud of me." Margaret listened to her granddaughter's one-sided conversation with Emily, sharing news about school friends, her piano recital, and the new book series she discovered in the library where Emily once worked. The child spoke with the confidence of someone who knew she was heard, even if she couldn't hear the response. "And Mama," Chloe continued, "I want you to know that Margaret's story teaches us that true strength often emerges when we least expect it. At 68, she discovered that age is just a number when love demands action. Her courage reminds us that sometimes the most important battles aren't fought with anger or aggression, but with quiet determination and unwavering love. The most powerful lesson here is about recognizing authentic love versus conditional affection. Chloe instinctively knew the difference between her father's expectations and her grandmother's unconditional acceptance. In our own lives, we should ask ourselves, do we love people for who they are or for who we want them to be? Emily's foresight in documenting her concerns shows us the importance of protecting those we love, even when it's uncomfortable or difficult. Sometimes being a good parent or grandparent means making tough decisions that others might not understand. For those facing family challenges today, remember that you don't have to be perfect to be worthy of love. You don't need wealth or youth to make a difference in someone's life. What matters most is showing up consistently, listening without judgment, and creating a safe space where love can flourish. Margaret's victory wasn't just legal. It was proof that when we fight for what's right with pure intentions, even the smallest voice can echo with the power of truth. Thank you for watching the video. Please comment with number 1 to let me know you have watched the whole video. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell to always receive new videos as soon as possible.